Billionaire visits, his ex-wife after 5 years, and what discovers leaves him breathless. The gravel road leading to Millbrook Hollow was not built for a car like his. Calloway Ashford sat behind the wheel of a rented Escalade because the Bentley was too conspicuous, he told himself, though the truth was closer to something he couldn't name, and watched the tires kick up clouds of pale Tennessee dust as the GPS signal flickered and died somewhere past mile marker 11. He was off the grid, intentionally, or at least that was what he kept telling himself as the sprawling green hills of the countryside opened up around him like something out of a painting, all golden light and silence, and the kind of slow, honest beauty that made a man from Chicago feel like a stranger in his own country. He hadn't called ahead. That was also intentional. Calloway was 51 years old, worth somewhere north of $3 billion, depending on the quarter. And he had spent the better part of the last 5 years making decisions that cut through ambiguity like a scalpel. He did not hesitate. He did not second-guess. He did not drive 2 hours from Nashville in a rental car to visit a woman he hadn't spoken to since the afternoon his attorney hand-delivered the finalized divorce papers to her sister's apartment on the south side of Atlanta. And yet here he was. He saw the sign before he saw the property, a hand-painted wooden board mounted between 2 cedar posts at the entrance of a gravel drive lined with wildflowers. Zara's Hollow, Artisan Studio and Retreat. The letters were done in deep mahogany paint, clean and deliberate, with a small woven motif painted beneath the name that he recognized as a Kente-inspired pattern, simple and elegant. The sign looked like it cost nothing. It looked like it was worth everything. Calloway pulled the Escalade to a stop just past the entrance and sat for a long moment with the engine running. He had driven down here because his company's legal team had flagged something in the Millbrook County zoning records 3 days ago, and a name had come up in the ownership documentation that had hit him somewhere deep in the chest, like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten existed. He had told himself it was due diligence. He had told himself it was business. He was starting to understand that was not entirely true. He killed the engine and stepped out. The air hit him first, warm and thick with honeysuckle and something earthy, fertile, alive. A sound came next, the rhythmic scrape and tuck of something being worked by hand, somewhere beyond the low wooden fence that separated the drive from the main yard. Then he rounded the fence post, and he saw her. Zara Okonkwo-Bell sat cross-legged on a woven mat in the front yard, her back half-turned toward the drive, her long braids tied low at the nape of her neck with loose strands catching the late afternoon light. She was wearing an olive-green blouse, embroidered at the collar, and sleeves in red and white, something hand-stitched, something that looked like it had a story, and a green skirt that spread around her, like a pool of still water. A straw hat lay on the ground beside her. Her hands were moving over a half-finished wicker basket with the kind of steady, unhurried confidence that takes years to develop. She hadn't heard him come in, or maybe she had, and had decided he wasn't worth interrupting her work for. That seemed more likely. Calloway stood at the edge of the yard and did not speak for a full 30 seconds. He was not a man who struggled with words. He was the kind of man who walked into a room full of hostile shareholders and changed the temperature of the air through sheer force of presence. But standing in this yard, in this golden October light, watching the woman he had once loved, the woman he had once broken, work with her hands like she had been doing it her whole life, something in his throat closed up and refused to cooperate. She looked different, not older exactly, fuller, settled, like she had grown into something she'd been reaching toward for years, and the reaching was finally over. She looked like a woman who no longer needed anything from the world, including him. "Zara," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rough at the edges. Her hands stopped, not dramatically, just a half-second pause, the kind of stillness that precedes recognition. Then she set the basket down on the mat beside her, straightened her spine, and turned to face him. Her expression did not collapse into shock. It did not soften into relief. It settled into something far more unsettling, calm recognition, the way you look at something you've already processed and filed away. "Calloway," she said, just his name, flat and clean, like a door closing. He had forgotten how her voice sounded. He realized that now, standing here, how thoroughly he had buried the memory of it, because it was the only way he'd been able to keep moving forward. Low and unhurried, with a warmth she kept deliberately out of reach when she didn't trust you. "I was in Nashville," he started. "You don't have family in Nashville." "A conference. You don't attend conferences. You send Brennan." She hadn't moved from her mat. She was looking at him the way you look at a weather system you've already prepared for, observant, unimpressed, not afraid. He exhaled slowly. "I should have called." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." She reached forward and picked the basket back up, turning it in her hands as if inspecting the weave. "But you didn't, so here we are." She looked up at him again, and this time there was something else in her eyes. Not hostility, not pain, just the steady patience of a woman who has been through worse and built something beautiful on the other side of it. "What do you want, Calloway?" He opened his mouth to answer, and that was when he heard it. Footsteps. Small, fast ones, the kind that only belonged to a child in a hurry. They came from the direction of the cellar barn at the far edge of the property, and then a small figure came racing around the side of the split-rail fence. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, with thick natural hair pulled into 2 puffs on either side of her head and a gap-toothed grin that she was apparently incapable of controlling. She was wearing denim overalls over a yellow long-sleeve shirt, and she was running with her whole body, arms pumping, completely committed to whatever destination she had in mind. She skidded to a stop when she saw Calloway. He stopped breathing. The girl stared up at him with enormous dark eyes, serious now, curious, assessing him with the unfiltered directness that only very young children still possess. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow in the shape of a crescent. Her nose was wide and flat at the bridge. Her jaw was strong for such a young face, and her eyes were the exact same deep-set, slow-blinking, amber-flecked brown as the ones Calloway saw every morning in his own bathroom mirror. The world tilted. Calloway looked from the child to Zara. Zara had gone very still, her hands loose around the basket, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Not fear, not guilt, not satisfaction. Something more complicated than any of those. Something that looked like it had been waiting 5 years to be witnessed. "Who is she?" he said. His voice came out barely above a whisper. Zara held his gaze for a long moment before she answered. "Her name is Imani," she said. "And that is a conversation you are not ready to have, standing at the edge of my yard." She looked down at the little girl, and her whole face changed. The armor softened, the edges rounded. Something warm and fierce and total moved through her expression like sunlight through glass. "Baby girl," she said gently, "go wash up for dinner. Ms. Katura has the table." The child, Imani, looked up at Calloway for one more long second, then cut her eyes to Zara, then turned and bolted back toward the farmhouse without a word, her overalls disappearing around the porch corner in a flash of yellow and denim. Calloway stood in the silence that followed and tried to remember how to breathe. Zara set the basket down, stood, and brushed the grass from her skirt with the same unhurried dignity she'd brought to everything else. She picked up the straw hat from the ground and held it at her side. "You can come inside," she said. Not an invitation exactly, more like a verdict. "But you will sit where I put you, and you will listen before you speak. Those are my terms." He nodded. He would have agreed to anything she said right then. She walked toward the farmhouse without waiting for him. He followed, 3 steps behind, the way a man follows when he's realizing, slowly, terribly and far too late, that he is the one who has been lost all along. Behind him, the sign at the entrance of Millbrook Hollow caught the last slant of golden light. The painted kente motif at its base looked like something woven by careful, deliberate hands. The kind of hands that know how to make something strong and beautiful out of whatever they're given. The kind of hands that don't wait to be saved. The kitchen smelled like cornbread and wood smoke, and something herbaceous she was simmering on the back burner. Thyme, maybe, or rosemary. Something that belonged to the earth. Calloway sat where Zara had pointed. A straight-backed chair at the far end of a long farmhouse table made of reclaimed wood, the surface worn smooth in the center where decades of hands had passed over it. The kitchen was large and practical and full of texture. Copper pots hanging from a ceiling rack, bundles of dried lavender and sage tied with twine along the window ledge, a row of ceramic canisters painted in earth tones lined up on the counter beside a cast-iron stand mixer. A child's drawing was pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Tennessee. It was not the kitchen of a woman who was struggling. That fact landed quietly, the way important facts often do, not with drama, but with the slow, undeniable weight of something you should have known sooner. Zara moved through the space with practiced ease, pouring 2 glasses of water, setting one in front of him without ceremony, then leaning back against the counter with her arms folded and her glass held loosely in one hand. She had taken the straw hat off and set it on the hook by the back door. Her braids hung loose now, falling past her shoulders. She looked, if possible, even more composed inside the house than she had in the yard. "She's not yours," Zara said. The words hit him like cold water. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding onto the breath he was about to ask the question with. "She's Denise's daughter," Zara continued, watching his face reset itself. "My sister. Denise passed away in the winter of 2022. Ovarian cancer, stage 4. She was diagnosed 6 weeks after I moved here and gone by March." She paused. Let the silence carry its own weight. Imani was 14 months old. There was no father in the picture. So I became her mother. A short pause. "Legally and in every other way that matters." Calloway exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, "about Denise." "I know you are." She took a sip of water. "She liked you, actually. Up until she didn't." He absorbed that. He deserved it. "Zara, I'm not finished." Her voice was even, not unkind, just precise. The voice of someone who has rehearsed a thing for a long time, not in anger, but in clarity. "You asked why I'm here, why Millbrook, why this?" She gestured loosely at the kitchen, the house, the whole of it. "I'll tell you, and then I want you to tell me why you actually drove 2 hours from Nashville without calling." He said nothing. He waited. She set the glass down on the counter. "When you left," she said, "I had $432 in a checking account and a studio apartment in your name that I had 30 days to vacate. I had no job because I had been managing your household and your social calendar for 3 years under the impression that we were building a life together." She did not raise her voice. She never had. That had always been the thing about Zara. She could take you completely apart in a normal register. "I had no health insurance because I had been on your company's plan and your attorney moved fast. And I was—" She stopped, just for a beat. The first crack. "I was 8 weeks pregnant." The room went absolutely still. Calloway felt something drop through the center of his chest, long and slow, like a stone going down through dark water. "Zara, don't." She held up one hand, not to stop him, to stabilize herself. She took a breath. When she spoke again, The steadiness was back, though it cost her more now than it had a minute ago. I lost the baby in January. I was in my sister's guest room in Atlanta, in the middle of a hard freeze, and I couldn't afford the ER. I called a nurse hotline. Denise sat on the floor with me all night. She picked up her glass again, held it like something to hold on to. I never told you because there was nothing to tell by the time there was anyone to tell it to, and I didn't want your money. I didn't want your guilt. I wanted... She stopped again, pressed her lips together. Then, it doesn't matter what I wanted. Calloway's hands were flat on the table. He could feel every grain of the wood under his palms. He was aware of his own breathing in a way he almost never was. The rise and fall of it, the inadequacy of it, the way it kept happening even when it didn't feel like it had any right to. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. There was no absolution in it, just fact. The back door opened and a woman in her 60s, with close-cropped natural hair and a flour-dusted apron, came in carrying a casserole dish, humming under her breath. She stopped when she registered Calloway at the table, looked at Zara with a quick, searching expression, and Zara gave the smallest shake of her head. The woman, Ms. Katura, he presumed, set the dish on the stove without a word and retreated quietly through the interior door, pulling it mostly closed behind her. The kind of move that only happens in a household built on trust and wordless communication. This property, Zara said, turning back to him, I found through a HUD auction in early 2021. I paid $47,000 for it. 8 acres, 2 outbuildings, the farmhouse and a barn. Everything needed work. She almost smiled, but it didn't quite complete itself. Denise thought I was losing my mind. She said I was running away. Were you? I was running towards something, she said. I just didn't know what it was yet. She turned to the window over the sink. Outside, the last of the October light was painting the cornfield in shades of copper and rust. I started making baskets my first winter here. Something Grandma Okonkwo taught me when I was young. I hadn't touched it in 20 years. I started because I needed something to do with my hands when the grief got heavy. She paused. By spring, I was selling them at the Franklin Farmers Market. By summer, I had a 4-month waiting list. Calloway looked at the basket she'd left on the kitchen counter. He hadn't noticed it when he came in. The weave was complex, asymmetrical, in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The pattern shifting from a tight geometric braid at the base to something looser and more organic near the rim. It looked like something you'd see in a gallery. It looked like something that cost real money. Zara's Hollow, he said, studio and retreat. She turned back from the window. I have 6 resident artists right now. Weavers, potters, a woodworker from Chattanooga. We run weekend workshops from April through November. I have a waiting list for those too. The retreat side generates about $12,000 a month in bookings. The studio side runs its own books separately. She held his eyes. The property is worth roughly $2.3 million at current appraisal. I own it free and clear. I did not borrow a single dollar from anyone who shares your last name. It was not said with pride. It was said with the quiet authority of someone stating coordinates. This is where I am. This is the ground I stand on. Note it carefully. I didn't come here because I thought you needed help, Calloway said. Then why did you come? He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded document, a printout from the county's zoning office, 2 pages of dense legal language with a property parcel map clipped to the back. He set it on the table and slid it toward her, without a word. She unfolded it, studied it. Her expression did not change for a long moment, and then something shifted behind her eyes, a tightening, a sharpening, the look of someone whose internal alarm system has just gone off very quietly. This is my land, she said. Parcel 7 of it, yes. The eastern acreage along the ridge. These are eminent domain pre-filings. She looked up at him. Millbrook Ridge Development Corridor. The county filed them 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks! She stopped, controlled herself, set the papers flat on the table with deliberate care. Who is behind the corridor project? Calloway held her gaze and said nothing for just long enough that she understood before he confirmed it. Your company. Not a question. Her voice had dropped to something very quiet. A subsidiary, he said, 3 layers removed. I didn't... His phone buzzed on the table between them. He glanced down out of reflex. It was Brennan Weiss, his partner, calling from Chicago. He reached for the phone to silence it. Answer it, Zara said. Zara, answer it, Calloway. Her eyes had gone very still, the kind of still that lives right at the edge of something enormous. I want to hear what he says when he thinks I'm not in the room. He looked at her for a moment, then he picked up. Brennan. The voice on the other end was smooth, efficient, the voice of a man who believed in momentum above all else. Cal. Good. Listen, the Millbrook acquisition is moving faster than we projected. County gave us a green light on the Ridge Corridor pre-filings. We need your signature on the Phase 2 approval by end of week, or we lose the construction window. The resort build starts in March, whether we're ready or not. A brief pause. Oh, and the primary holdout property? The Artisan Place. Owner is a Zara Okonkwo Bell. Goes by Okonkwo Bell professionally, but she was... The pause this time was different, calibrated. She was married to you back in the day, just flagging it. Could be awkward, or could be an advantage depending on how you play it. Calloway's jaw tightened. Zara was watching him across the table. She had not moved. Her hands were flat on the zoning documents, and her expression had gone completely, terrifyingly composed. I'll call you back, Calloway said. He ended the call. In the silence that followed, Imani's laughter drifted in from somewhere upstairs, bright and completely unburdened, the laugh of a child who has been raised inside something safe. The cornbread smell drifted from the oven. Outside, a mockingbird was working through its evening repertoire in the old oak tree by the fence. Zara picked up the zoning documents, folded them, set them back in front of him. When she finally spoke, her voice was so controlled it was almost frightening. Get out of my house, Calloway. He didn't move. Let me explain. I said get out. Still not loud, still not breaking. Something behind the calm was enormous, and she was holding it back with both hands. I let you into this house, and sat across from you, and told you things I have never said out loud to another living soul. And this whole time, your company has been quietly filing to take my land. She stood. Get out before I stop being polite about it. He rose slowly, folding his jacket over his arm. There was nothing he could say that would not make this worse. He walked to the back door, stopped with his hand on the frame. I didn't know, he said again, quieter this time. You never do, she said. That's always been the problem. He walked out into the evening. Behind him, the kitchen door clicked shut. In his breast pocket, his phone buzzed again. Brennan calling back. He stood in the cooling Tennessee air and stared at Brennan's name on the screen until it stopped. Then he pulled up the contact for his personal attorney in Chicago, and he typed a single text message. I need to know everything about the Millbrook Ridge Development Corridor. Tonight, all of it. He looked back at the farmhouse. In the upstairs window, a small silhouette was visible behind the curtain. Imani, watching the stranger in the yard with enormous, assessing eyes. He thought about Zara saying, I was 8 weeks pregnant. He thought about January, a hard freeze, a nurse hotline, a sister sitting on the floor. He thought about $3 billion sitting in 14 different portfolios, earning interest through the night, every night, without him having to do a single thing. And he thought about how utterly, catastrophically useless all of it had been to the person who had needed him most. His phone buzzed one more time. This time it wasn't Brennan. It was a text from his attorney. Cal, the Millbrook acquisition. You need to see this tonight. Brennan's been running this for 18 months. He used your signature on a pre-authorization from 2022. You're going to want to sit down. Calloway stood very still in the middle of the gravel drive. The mockingbird had stopped singing. The last of the light was gone. And somewhere inside the farmhouse, a little girl with amber-flecked eyes that looked like his was sitting down to dinner at a table her mother had built with her own 2 hands, on land that someone was trying to take away. He was not going to let that happen. The Hampton Inn off I-65 was not the kind of place Calloway Ashford normally slept. The mattress was soft in the wrong places. The air conditioning unit rattled every 40 minutes like it was trying to tell him something. And the parking lot light outside his window threw a thin orange stripe across the ceiling that he stared at from midnight until 3 in the morning, while his attorney, Delphine Okafor, walked him through everything she'd found. It took 2.5 hours. By the end of it, Calloway was sitting on the edge of the bed in his dress shirt and socks, the phone pressed hard against his ear. A yellow legal pad covered in his own handwriting on the nightstand beside him. Names, dates, holding company structures, a web of shell entities that had been constructed with the precise, patient architecture of someone who had spent a long time making sure the blame would land somewhere else. He used the pre-authorization from the Denver Portfolio Review, Delphine said. Her voice was clipped and careful, the way it always got when she was keeping her fury professional. The one you signed in October 2022, authorizing exploratory acquisition activity in undervalued rural corridors in the southeast. It was boilerplate. You signed 50 documents in that session. He extracted the signature block and embedded it into the Millbrook Ridge Formation documents. It's not identical, but it's close enough that a county clerk in Tennessee wouldn't know the difference. How long has he been running this? The shell company that anchors the acquisition, Vellecroft Land Partners, was formed in March of 2022. That's 7 months before he used your signature. He had this in motion before he ever put a document in front of you. Calloway was quiet for a moment. What does he stand to gain? The resort project is projected at a $460 million build. Vellecroft holds a silent 15% stake in the development consortium. That's $69 million, approximately, once the project reaches full capitalization. A pause. Not counting the land flip margin on the acquired parcels. $69 million, built on a forged signature and 8 acres of land belonging to a woman who had lost everything because of him once already. The primary holdout parcel, Calloway said. Zara's property. 8.3 acres, including the ridge access easement. Without that easement, the resort development loses its primary scenic overlook site, the one featured in all the marketing materials. The project doesn't collapse without it, but it loses a significant portion of its premium positioning. Delphine paused again. Brennan knows this, which is why the parcel is flagged as priority acquisition in the internal documents. They need it. What happens if I block Phase 2 approval? Another pause. This one longer, more deliberate. Calloway, if you withhold signature on Phase 2, the construction window closes. The county pre-filings lapse. Vellecroft loses the assembled land package and the consortium dissolves. She stopped, but Brennan has a co-signatory path. If you don't sign by Friday, the operating agreement gives him access to the board's emergency authorization track. He'd need 3 of 5 board members. He has 3. He has 4, Delphine said quietly. Moorfield changed his vote 2 weeks ago. Calloway stood up from the bed and walked to the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a semi parked at the far end, with its running lights on, orange and steady in the dark. Somewhere on the interstate beyond the tree line, a truck rolled past, and its headlights swept the sky briefly before disappearing. Moorfield. He had brought Moorfield onto the board himself 11 years ago because he'd trusted the man's read on risk. That trust, apparently, had an expiration date. "What's my window?" he asked. 72 hours from when Brennan last tried to reach you, which means Friday at 6 p.m. Yes. He stood at the window for a long moment. 3 days. 3 days to dismantle something that had been built over 3 years while he'd been looking the other direction. While he'd been running a company and closing deals and telling himself that the emptiness in the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive was a reasonable trade for the momentum of building something great. He thought about Zara's face when she'd heard Brennan's voice through the phone. The way the warmth had drained out of her expression and something ancient and exhausted had moved in behind it. Not surprise, not even anger, just the weary recognition of a woman who has been here before. The world reduces people and then asks why they're smaller. He was not going to let that happen again. "Delphine," he said, "I need a full brief on every board member and their exposure to Brennan by 7 a.m. And I need a clean legal path to block the Phase 2 approval unilaterally if the board goes against me. I'll start now." He hung up and set the phone on the windowsill and looked out at the parking lot for a long time. He drove back to Millbrook Hollow at 8 in the morning, before Zara would have reason to expect him, and sat in the Escalade on the gravel drive for 3 minutes before he heard the back door of the farmhouse open and Ms. Keturah step out onto the porch with a mug of coffee and an expression that made it very clear she had seen him arrive. She looked at him the way older women look at men who need to be assessed, thoroughly and without hurry. "She's in the studio barn," she said. "Not unfriendly, not warm, informational the way you give a man directions to a place he hasn't earned yet. You can wait on the porch if you need to wait." He waited on the porch. The morning was cool and bright, the hills beyond the property lit up in full October color, red oak and sweet gum and hickory burning orange and amber against a sky so blue it looked like something from a different season entirely. A group of chickens worked the side yard with businesslike efficiency. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen through the screen door. He had forgotten that places like this existed. Or maybe he had never known. Zara came out of the studio barn 20 minutes later, carrying a finished basket in one hand and a set of pattern notes in the other, and she stopped at the edge of the porch steps when she saw him. Her expression cycled through something quickly, not softening, but recalibrating. The surprise of him still being here. The decision about what to do with it. She came up the steps and set the basket and notes on the porch table. "I told you to leave," she said. "You did. You're still here." "I am." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the legal pad from the night before and the printout from Delphine. He set them on the table beside the basket. "Sit with me for 10 minutes, please." The please cost him something. She could hear it. He saw it register in the slight shift of her posture. She sat in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap and waited. He walked her through all of it, methodically, without embellishment. The pre-authorization, the signature extraction, Velacroft land partners, Brennan's silent stake, Moorfield's defection, the 72-hour window. He gave her the legal pad. He gave her Delphine's brief. He gave her everything. When he finished, she sat for a long moment looking at the documents. "He's been planning this for 3 years, she said. "Yes." "And your name is on the formation documents." "A fraudulent use of my name." "Yes." She looked up at him. "Can you prove the fraud?" Delphine believes so. It requires forensic document analysis, but the signature geometry is distinct enough from my actual signature that an expert can distinguish it. It will take time, however. Time we don't have before Friday. "So you can't clear your name before the deadline?" "Not definitively, no." She absorbed this. Outside, one of the resident artists, a young man in paint-spattered overalls, crossed the yard toward the ceramic studio at the far end of the property, coffee mug in hand, oblivious to the quiet catastrophe being laid out on the porch. "What can you do before Friday?" Zara asked. Calloway was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "I can withdraw from the board. Voluntarily and publicly. It triggers a mandatory project review under the operating agreement and freezes all Phase 2 activity until the review is complete. The construction window closes. The county pre-filings lapse." He paused. "It costs me my position in the company, and depending on how Brennan moves, it could trigger a hostile restructuring of my equity stake. I'm looking at losing somewhere between 40 and 60% of my holdings in Ashford Capital." Zara stared at him. "That's not a small number," she said slowly. "No, you'd still be... Yes, I would still be comfortable." He said the word with a flatness that had nothing to do with dismissal, more like the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years calibrating his life around a number and is only now asking himself why. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you what the move costs, so you understand that I'm not offering you something that's free." She was quiet for a long moment. The morning light had shifted, coming now at a lower angle through the oak tree, making complicated patterns on the porch floor. "Why?" she said. It was the simplest and most devastating question she could have asked. He looked at her. "Because it's your land, Zara. You built this. You built it out of nothing, and you built it alone, and no one, including me, especially me, has the right to take it from you." She looked away. Her jaw was working slightly, the muscle just above the hinge, the way it always did when she was processing something that she refused to let touch her face. "I don't want you to do this as payment," she said carefully, "for what happened. I'm not a debt." "I know you're not. I mean it, Calloway. If this is about guilt, it's about Brennan using my name to steal from you." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something old and heated. "The guilt is separate. The guilt is mine to carry, and it doesn't get to become your problem. This is about a fraud that I have the power to stop, and I'm going to stop it." She turned back to look at him. For the first time since he'd arrived in Millbrook, she looked at him without armor, just looked at him openly, the way she used to before everything fell apart. The way that had always made him feel more visible than he wanted to be. "Okay," she said, "just that." "Okay." He nodded. From inside the farmhouse, Imani's voice floated out through the screen door. "Ms. Keturah, can I have the maple kind?" And then Ms. Keturah's voice, patient and deep. "You can have half of the maple kind and half of the regular kind, and you can be grateful for both." Zara almost smiled. "She negotiates everything," Zara said quietly. "Every single thing." "How old is she?" 4.5. She looked toward the door. "She's the reason I get up at 5:30, the reason I built the studio, the reason I don't let things slide." She paused. "She's the whole reason, honestly." Calloway looked at the basket on the table. The weave was extraordinary up close. A double coil pattern in natural ryegrass, with a band of hand-dyed indigo reed running the circumference at 2/3 height, the color deep and consistent in a way that meant the dyeing had been done right. "What does one of these go for?" he asked. "This one's commissioned, private client in Nashville, $1,200. He looked at it again. "You could charge more." "I know what I charge," she said, and there was something in it that was almost, not quite, a smile. His phone buzzed. He looked down. Brennan. Again. He turned the phone face down on the table. On the porch rail, a red-tailed hawk landed without warning, scanned the yard with complete authority, and lifted off again in the same motion. "I need to make some calls," Calloway said. From here, if that's all right." Zara looked at him for a moment. Then she stood, picked up her basket and her notes, and moved toward the door. "Ms. Katura makes lunch at noon," she said, pausing with her hand on the screen door. "You can eat, or you can leave before then. Either way." She looked back at him just for a second. "But if you're still on that porch at noon, she's going to feed you whether you want her to or not. Fair warning." The door swung shut behind her. Calloway sat on the porch of Millbrook Hollow, with his phone in his hand and the October light coming through the oak tree and the sound of a child negotiating over maple syrup drifting from inside the house. He dialed Delphine. "Start the withdrawal filing," he said. "Tonight." He was still on the porch at noon. He ate 2 bowls of Ms. Katura's black-eyed pea soup and a square of cornbread without being asked twice, and Imani sat across from him at the porch table and stared at him with those amber-flecked eyes, and asked him, with complete seriousness, whether he had ever seen a chicken lay an egg in real life. He had not. She found this information extremely satisfying. Zara watched from the kitchen doorway with an expression he could not read, and later, when he was back on the phone with Delphine, he heard her in the studio barn, the soft rhythm of her hands on the basket frames, steady and unhurried, the sound of someone who has learned to build in whatever time they have. He worked the phones until 4 in the afternoon. Delphine. 2 board members he trusted, his private equity attorney in Toronto. At 4:15 he received a text from Brennan that read, "I know you're in Tennessee. We need to talk before you do something you can't take back." He put the phone in his pocket. At 4:17 he heard Zara's footsteps on the porch behind him. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him for a moment and looked out at the cornfield and the ridge beyond it, her ridge, her land, the view she had been looking at for 5 years. And then she said, quietly, "He texted me too." Calloway turned to look at her. $4 million, she said, cash for the property. He said the offer expires Friday. The number sat between them in the cool afternoon air. She was looking at the ridge. Her expression was the one she used when she was doing math that went beyond numbers. "That's a lot of money, Zara." "I know what it is." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were very clear and very serious. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that I'm not naive about what's on the table. On both sides," she held his gaze, "and I'm telling you that the answer is no." Calloway let out a breath. "But Calloway," her voice dropped slightly, "if you're going to burn down your own company to save this land, and then something else comes along next year and the year after that, I need to know you're doing this because it's right, not because you think it buys you something with me." He held her gaze. "It doesn't buy me anything with you," he said. "I know that." She studied him for a long moment, then she nodded once, turned, and went back inside. He stood on the porch and looked at the ridge, and somewhere behind him the screen door swung shut, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the hills, and the land held its ground the way it always had, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human dramas being worked out in its shadow. The community of Millbrook Hollow moved at a rhythm that had nothing to do with Chicago. In Chicago, Calloway's world operated in 15-minute intervals, calls, meetings, briefs, decisions, the machinery of capital grinding forward in an endless loop that mistook motion for meaning. Here the mornings began with mist on the hills and the sound of someone starting a fire in the ceramic kiln, and the afternoons ended with whoever was around pulling chairs together on the main porch, because that was simply what you did when the day's work was winding down. There was no agenda. There was no deliverable. There was cornbread and sweet tea and a woodworker from Chattanooga named Roswell Fitch, who had opinions about grain direction and no interest whatsoever in the Dow Jones. Calloway spent Wednesday and Thursday at Millbrook. He did not plan to. He did not announce that he was staying. He simply did not leave, and no one asked him to, and so he remained, sleeping in the guest room that Miss Katura prepared without commentary, conducting his business calls from the porch in the mornings and the driveway in the afternoons when the reception was better, and spending the hours in between watching what Zara had built with an attention that felt increasingly like penance. It was real. That was the thing that kept hitting him. It was not a hobby that had gotten out of hand. It was not a retreat from the world disguised as a lifestyle. It was a functioning, living institution, an actual working studio with actual working artists, producing actual work that people actually paid real money for, embedded in a rural community that it had quietly become essential to. 3 of the 6 resident artists were from Millbrook or the surrounding county. The weekend workshops had brought $11,000 in out-of-state visitor spending to local businesses last year alone. The County Agricultural Extension Office had a partnership with the studio for sustainable land management consultation. Zara had not just built a business, she had built a place. Calloway had built a company that was currently trying to demolish it. He did not forget that. He was not allowed to forget it. Thursday morning, he was on the porch with coffee and his legal pad when a silver Suburban with Illinois plates rolled slowly up the gravel drive and stopped 30 feet from the porch steps. Brennan Weiss stepped out. He was 63 years old and looked 55, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of weekend casual clothing that cost as much as formal wear but was calibrated to suggest he was relaxed about it. He had the walk of a man who was accustomed to arriving places and having the energy shift in his favor. He looked at Calloway on the porch. He looked at the coffee mug. He looked at the legal pad with a brief, practiced read. Long enough to note that there was writing on it, too far away to make out specifics. "Hell of a place to conduct business," Brennan said. His voice was easy, almost appreciative. "It is," Calloway said. He did not stand up. Brennan came up the porch steps and took the chair across from him, the one Zara usually sat in, and leaned back in it with his elbows on the armrests and his hands loose. Comfortable, unconcerned. "You didn't return my calls," Brennan said. "No. Delphine filed a preliminary withdrawal notice with the board last night." He paused. Not accusatory. More like noting a weather development. "That's a significant move, Cal." "It is. You want to walk me through your thinking?" Calloway looked at him steadily. "The Millbrook acquisition was built on a forged authorization. The signature on the Vellecroft formation documents is not mine. Forensic analysis will confirm that." Brennan's expression did not change. Not a flicker. Not a tightening. The face of a man who has had this conversation in his head many times already and prepared all the exits. "That's a serious allegation," Brennan said. "It's a serious crime." A pause. A single bird called from the oak tree. The morning was very still. "Cal." Brennan's voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but more textured. The voice he used when he wanted to suggest that they were the same kind of animal and should remember it. "You've been up here for 3 days, sitting on this woman's porch. I get it. History, guilt, all of that. But you're about to blow up 12 years of partnership over something that can be managed. The acquisition is clean at the county level. The signature issue is ambiguous. The board will see it that way." "The board will see what Delphine puts in front of them," Calloway said. "And Delphine is very thorough. You'd be walking away from the company, I'm aware, 40 to 60% of your equity at current valuations. I've run the numbers." Brennan looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his eyes, not the calculation leaving, but a different calculation arriving, slower and more careful. "She really got to you," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "This isn't about Zara, isn't it? This is about you putting my name on a fraudulent document to fund a project that would demolish a woman's livelihood." Calloway set his coffee mug down. "I'd be doing this if it were a stranger's property." Brennan looked at him. "Would you?" A long silence. "Yes," Calloway said, and he meant it. Brennan sat for another moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket with the habitual precision of a man who does everything precisely, and looked out at the property, the studio barn, the ceramic studio, the cornfield, the ridge beyond. "It's a pretty piece of land," he said. "It is. $4 million is a fair offer. You should know she's already turned it down." Something moved across Brennan's face. Something that might have been respect, briefly, before it was buried again. "I'll be in contact with the board directly," he said. "I'd expect nothing less." Brennan went down the porch steps and back to the Suburban. At the driver's door, he paused, looked back at Calloway one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't know she was your ex-wife when this started. I found out 18 months in. And you kept going. It was already in motion." "That's not an answer, Brennan." The Suburban door closed. The engine turned over. The vehicle rolled back down the gravel drive and turned onto the county road and disappeared. Calloway sat alone on the porch for a long moment. Then he heard the screen door, and Zara was standing in the frame, coffee mug in hand, looking at the empty drive. "Was that him?" she said. "Yes." She came out and sat in her chair and looked at the property the same way she always did, taking inventory, checking in on something she was responsible for. "What did he say?" "He confirmed that he knows the signature is fraudulent. He didn't say so directly, but he didn't argue it either." Calloway paused. "He's going to go to the board." She nodded slowly. "And the withdrawal filing?" "Delphine is moving forward. It triggers the freeze." He looked at her. "But Zara, I need you to hear something. Even with the freeze, even if the construction window closes, this doesn't end cleanly. Brennan has resources and he has patience. He could restructure and come back in 18 months with a different approach. You need independent legal counsel on the property title. Good counsel, not a generalist." "I have a lawyer," she said. "Get a second one." He said it without condescension. "One who specializes in eminent domain defense and rural property rights. I can give you 3 names. She looked at him. "I don't want your names." "They're Delphine's names. She pulled them this morning." A beat. "I'll look at them," she said. "Good." Imani came out the back door in her pajamas and straw hat. The hat apparently went on regardless of the rest of the outfit, and climbed directly into Zara's lap with the total physical confidence of a child who has never once worried about whether a lap would be available. "Is that man gone?" she asked, looking at the drive. Zara wrapped an arm around her. "Yes, baby, he's gone." "He looked at our chickens funny." He did. Like he was deciding something about them. Zara looked at Calloway. He looked back. Something almost broke between them. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition. Thanksgiving that year came early to Millbrook Hollow. It was not actually Thanksgiving. It was the second Saturday of November, 3 weeks after Calloway had first appeared at the gate, and it was organized in the space of 48 hours by a loose coalition of artists, farmers, and neighbors who moved with the efficient warmth of people who know how to show up for each other without being asked twice. The cause was simple and immediate. The Millbrook Ridge corridor story had broken in the Tennessean on Thursday morning, a piece by an investigative reporter who had gotten hold of Vellecroft's formation documents and the county zoning pre-filings and had put together a clean, clear, damning story about a Chicago-based development consortium quietly assembling rural land for a commercial resort project. Zara's Hollow was named. Photographs of the studio, the barn, the ridge, the community workshops. Interviews with 3 of the resident artists and Roswell Fitch and 2 neighboring farmers, whose parcels were also in the acquisition footprint. The story spread. Nashville local news picked it up Friday. By Saturday morning, it was circulating in the Tennessee arts community, the heritage craft community, the rural land rights community, and several corners of the internet that care deeply about exactly this kind of thing. The gathering was not a protest. It was a potluck. 43 people came to Millbrook Hollow that Saturday and filled the main yard and the porch and spilled out into the drive. Artists from the studio community, farmers from the surrounding parcels, people from Millbrook proper and from the next county over who had heard about the workshops and the retreat and felt that this place was worth defending. They brought food, sweet potato pies and ham and green bean casserole and 3 different kinds of cornbread, including one from a woman named Florentine Bray, who drove 40 minutes from Murfreesboro because she had taken a weaving workshop in August and said it had changed her life and she was not going to let anyone demolish that. Calloway stood at the edge of the yard and watched it happen. He felt, for possibly the first time in his adult life, like the least important person at a gathering. It was not an unpleasant feeling. Zara moved through the crowd the way she moved through everything, with purpose and warmth and the quiet authority of someone who has built a thing and knows its worth. She laughed at something Roswell said. She knelt down to talk to 2 children who were examining the chickens with grave scientific interest. She accepted a hug from Florentine Bray and held it longer than Calloway expected, the 2 women standing in the yard with their arms around each other while the crowd moved around them. Miss Coutura touched Calloway's arm. "You going to stand here all afternoon?" she said. "I don't want to be in the way." She looked at him the way she had the first morning, thorough, unhurried. "You've been not in the way for 3 weeks," she said. "It's becoming a posture." She handed him a bowl. "Go be useful. There's not enough chairs on the east side of the porch." He went and moved chairs. In the late afternoon, when the food was going and the light was going golden across the hills, Calloway found himself standing with Roswell Fitch at the edge of the property looking at the ridge. "You the one filing against the acquisition?" Roswell asked. He was a big man, 60s, with sawdust in the creases of his shirt. "Yes? Gonna stick?" "I believe so." Roswell considered this. "She built that ridge path herself," he said, nodding toward the cleared trail that ran up the eastern slope. "First spring she was here, just her and a mattock, and about 3 weeks of mornings." He shook his head slowly. "Stubborn doesn't even begin to cover it." "No," Calloway said. "It doesn't." Roswell looked at him sideways. "You the ex-husband?" "Yes." Long pause. "She doesn't talk about it. Whatever it was." "That's fair. You here to fix it?" Calloway looked at the ridge. "I'm here to not make it worse." Roswell made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's a start, I suppose." From across the yard, Imani came running with a piece of sweet potato pie on a plate that was tilting at a dangerous angle, and she navigated through the crowd with enormous concentration and deposited it in Calloway's hands like it was a diplomatic mission she had been assigned and was determined to complete. "Ms. Coutura said this one's yours," she announced, "because you moved all the chairs." "Did she?" "She said you earned it." She looked up at him with those amber-flecked eyes, very serious. "Did you earn it?" Calloway looked down at the pie, looked at the little girl. "I'm working on it," he said. She seemed to find this acceptable. She turned and ran back toward the porch. Roswell watched her go. "That child," he said, "is something else entirely." "Yes," Calloway said, "she is." He left Millbrook that evening when the gathering was winding down. He had board calls starting Monday morning in Chicago and a legal deposition Tuesday that Delphine had warned him not to miss. He said goodbye to Ms. Katura, who handed him a covered dish and told him to eat properly. He said goodbye to Roswell, who shook his hand and said nothing additional, which felt like the right amount. He found Zara by the studio barn in the last of the daylight, stacking the folding tables they'd borrowed from the community center. He helped her carry 2 of them inside, without asking. "You should know," he said, when they were setting the last one against the barn wall, "that the withdrawal is filed, officially. It went through this morning." She turned to look at him. "The board meeting is Monday," he continued. "Brennan will push for the emergency authorization track, but I've spoken to 2 members who are going to block it. That gives us a deadlock, which triggers the mandatory 60-day project review, enough time for Delphine to build the fraud case properly." Zara stood in the dim interior of the barn, surrounded by stacked baskets and finished work, and the earthy smell of ryegrass and linseed oil, and she looked at him with an expression that he had not seen before from her. Not gratitude. She was too precise about what she owed people to offer gratitude for something she hadn't asked for. Something quieter than that, something that recognized what had been spent. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I want you to hear it." A pause. "Thank you, Calloway." He nodded. They stood in the barn for a moment without speaking. Outside, the voices of the remaining guests drifted from the yard, and Imani's laughter cut through all of it, bright and total. "Drive safe," Zara said. She picked up her basket notes from the workbench and turned back toward the farmhouse. He walked to the Escalade. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, the engine not yet running, looking at the farmhouse through the windshield. The lit windows, the porch, the sign at the entrance catching the last of the light. Then his phone lit up with a text from Brennan. "The board's taking the emergency track anyway. You've been outvoted, Cal. Moorfield brought in 2 more. The window is still open. See you Monday." Calloway read the text, read it again. He put the phone face down on the passenger seat and looked at the farmhouse one more time. Then he picked the phone back up and dialed Delphine. "They're going to take the emergency track," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been monitoring the board communications. Brennan moved fast." "What do we do?" A pause, then steady and precise. "We file for a temporary restraining order in federal court on the grounds of fraudulent authorization. Tonight, it's a Hail Mary, but the judge in the Western District has a history of granting emergency TROs in land fraud cases." Another pause. "And Calloway, if we do this, it becomes public. Everything. The fraud, your withdrawal, all of it." He looked at the farmhouse. "File it," he said. The federal courthouse in Nashville opened its emergency docket at 7:15 on a Monday morning, and by 8:42 a temporary restraining order had been granted against all Phase 2 activity in the Millbrook Ridge Development Corridor, pending a full evidentiary hearing on the grounds of fraudulent authorization. Delphine called Calloway with the news while he was sitting in a rental car in the courthouse parking garage, and he sat very still for a moment after she said it, not the stillness of relief exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "How long does the TRO hold?" he asked. 60 days minimum, potentially 90 if the judge grants the extension. That gives us time to build the fraud case properly. The forensic document examiner I've retained has already flagged 3 distinct geometric inconsistencies in the signature on the Vellecroft formation documents. A pause. Brennan's attorneys filed a motion to vacate within 30 minutes of the TRO being granted. They were waiting. He had people at the courthouse. He had people at the courthouse. Calloway exhaled. And the board meeting this morning? Suspended. The TRO covers all project-related activity, which the board's emergency authorization vote qualifies as. Moorfield's attorney has already been in contact with Delphine's office, arguing that the suspension is overreach. She paused. It's not, but they'll keep arguing. Let them argue. He watched a family cross the parking garage on foot, a woman with 2 kids in tow, moving fast. The kids skipping over the painted lines on the concrete in that particular way children have of making a game out of any surface. What's the public exposure looking like? The Tennessean ran an update this morning with the TRO as the leadee. AP picked it up. There's a piece in the Chicago Tribune business section that names you, not unfavorably for what it's worth. They're framing it as a whistleblower situation. A beat. Brennan's name is getting significant traction. Good. Cal. Her voice shifted slightly. Your equity position, the voluntary withdrawal combined with the TRO filing and the public exposure. Ashford Capital's share price dropped 4% at open. Some of that will recover. Some of it won't. A pause. I need you to be clear-eyed about what this looks like on the other side. He was quiet for a moment. I'm clear-eyed, Delphine. You're going to be a significantly smaller version of what you were 2 weeks ago. I know. And you're comfortable with that? He thought about Zara on the porch, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking at the ridge with the particular ownership of someone who has earned the view. He thought about Imani skipping through the yard in her straw hat. He thought about 43 people bringing sweet potato pie to defend something worth defending. I'm more comfortable with it than I've been with anything in a long time, he said. Delphine was quiet for a beat. Not her legal strategy quiet, but a different kind. The kind that meant she had something to say that wasn't in her professional vocabulary. Good, she said finally. I'll call you when Brennan's team makes their next move. He sat in the parking garage for another few minutes after she hung up, and then he drove back toward Millbrook. The snow started somewhere around Brentwood, light and tentative at first. The kind of early November flurry that Tennesseans look at with mild alarm and Chicagoans don't even bother to name. By the time he turned onto the county road toward Millbrook, it had picked up considerably. Thick, fast flakes driving sideways across the headlights, the fields on either side of the road going white in real time. He was not supposed to be at Millbrook tonight. He had a room at the Hampton Inn. He had calls in the morning. He had told himself, somewhere on the drive south from Nashville, that he was only going to deliver the news about the TRO in person because Zara deserved to hear it directly, not through a text or a news alert, and then he was going to drive back to the hotel and spend the evening working through the equity restructuring documents Delphine had sent. That was the plan. The plan lasted until the snow intensified past the point where the GPS was routing him back through an unsalted secondary road, and the Escalade's traction control started making its opinion known, and he pulled into Millbrook Hollow at 6:47 in the evening, less because he had decided to, and more because the night had made the decision for him. Zara was in the studio barn when he arrived. The farmhouse was lit but quiet. Ms. Katura's car was gone, which meant Imani was likely at the neighbors for the evening, a standing arrangement on Monday nights. He knocked on the barn door and heard her say, "Come in," without looking up from the frame she was working on. He came in. She looked up, processed him standing in her doorway with November snow on his shoulders. Her expression cycled through something quickly and settled. TRO was granted, he said. Something released in her face, controlled, small, but real. She set the frame down. 60 days? Minimum. Delphine thinks we can get 90. She nodded slowly. She was wearing a canvas work apron over a heavy flannel shirt, and her braids were piled up on top of her head in a loose knot. She had a streak of natural dye on her left forearm that she apparently hadn't noticed. "How bad is it?" she said. "For you." He had not expected her to ask that first. "The equity position took a hit this morning," he said. "It'll stabilize at somewhere between 60 and 70 cents on the dollar, depending on how the fraud case resolves and how the board restructures." He paused. "I'll be fine. But not what you were. No, not what I was." He looked around the barn, the finished baskets on the shelves, the drying frames, the organized bins of reed and ryegrass and dyed materials arranged by color along the far wall. "I don't think what I was is something I'm trying to get back to." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled a stool out from under the work table and set it on his side of the room. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you haven't slept." "I slept some." "Sit down, Calloway." He sat. She went back to her frame, but she didn't pick it up. She stood at the work table with her hands resting on its surface, looking at the half-formed basket in front of her, and she was quiet for long enough that the only sound in the barn was the snow against the corrugated metal roof and the low creak of the structure settling in the wind. "I called Delphine's contact," she said, "the land rights attorney, or Solya Vance, out of Knoxville." A pause. "She's good. We have a meeting next week." "Good." She said the TRO gives us standing for an independent property rights claim that's separate from the fraud case. Even if Brennan somehow survives the fraud charges, the eminent domain pre-filings are challengeable on their own merits. She looked up at him. She said she's seen the Millbrook corridor documentation, and the county's public interest finding is thin, borderline pretextual. Delphine said the same. "So there are two fronts." "There are two fronts." She nodded. She picked up the basket frame, set it down again. There was something she was working toward. He had always been able to tell. The way she got almost still when she was approaching something she needed to say from the right direction. "The board," she said. "What happens to your position there after all this?" "I resigned from the board as part of the withdrawal filing." "I know that. I mean, is there anything to go back to, if you wanted to?" He thought about it honestly. Ashford Capital will restructure around whatever Brennan doesn't manage to hold on to. Someone will step in. There'll be a version of the company that continues. He paused. "Whether I want to be part of it is a different question." "What's the answer to the different question?" He looked at his hands on his knees. "I built that company for 15 years. I told myself I was building something that mattered. A platform, a legacy, language I used because I needed to justify the hours and the cost of it." He stopped. "Brennan was my partner for 12 of those 15 years, and for at least 3 of them, he was using the company I built to fund something he was hiding from me." He paused. "That changes what the thing was. You can't unknow that." Zara was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. Simply. He looked up. She was watching him with an expression he recognized from a long time ago, the one she used when she meant something completely, when she wasn't performing the emotion but inhabited it. "You lost something too," she said. "It's not the same as what you—" "I didn't say it was the same. I said you lost something." She held his gaze. "It's allowed to cost you something, Calloway. You're allowed to grieve a thing, even if you should have protected it better." He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. The snow was coming harder now. The barn roof was taking it in long, low rushes, and somewhere outside, a branch came down under the weight of it. He heard the crack and the soft collapse. "You should stay," she said. "The road back to the interstate is going to be bad." "I don't want to impose." "You've been imposing for 3 weeks, she said, not unkindly. "One more night isn't going to change the accounting." He almost smiled. "Is that your version of an invitation?" "It's my version of a practical assessment." She picked up the basket frame. "Ms. Katura left soup on the stove. Guest room is made up. There's wood by the back door if the fire needs feeding." She glanced at him sideways. "And if you touch the thermostat past 68 degrees, I will know." He fed the fire. He ate the soup, a thick lentil and smoked sausage, heavy with winter herbs, the kind of soup that means it. He sat at the long farmhouse table after dinner with a cup of tea and the equity restructuring documents on his laptop, working through numbers that had once felt enormous, and now felt, if not small exactly, then less sovereign than they used to. Money had always been the thing he understood best. Its language, its logic, the particular grammar of risk and return. But sitting in this kitchen, in this house, in this community that Zara had built on $47,000 and 5 years of early mornings, he was aware that he had spent a long time mistaking fluency for wisdom. He knew the language. He had never quite learned what it was supposed to be for. Zara came in from the barn at 9:30, shaking snow from her shoulders, and she set her basket notes on the counter and washed her hands at the sink without speaking. He watched her move through the kitchen the way he'd been watching her move through spaces for 3 weeks now. The efficiency of it, the lack of wasted motion. The way she inhabited a room without needing to announce herself. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She dried her hands, turned. "The retreat," he said. "The expansion you mentioned. What's the plan? The real one, not the version you tell people when they ask." She looked at him for a moment. Then she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table across from him. And she told him. It was detailed and specific, and clearly something she had been building in her head for a long time. A second studio building on the eastern portion of the property with dedicated climate-controlled space for archival quality fiber work, a residency program expansion from 6 to 12 artists, a partnership with Fisk University in Nashville for an apprenticeship track, a small retail and gallery space that could serve the tourist traffic from the nearby state park. She had site plans sketched. She had preliminary cost estimates. She had a list of grant sources she'd already applied to, and 3 she was preparing applications for. She had been doing this, he realized. All of it. While the TRO was being filed, and the board was maneuvering and Brennan was threatening, she had been sitting in the barn at night, building the next version of Millbrook Hollow in her notebooks. She didn't wait for things to resolve before she started building. She never had. "The bottleneck is capital," she said. "Not a lot. The grant track is solid, and the retreat revenue is growing. But the building costs for the second studio are more than I want to finance through the retreat alone. I don't want to be leveraged on the operation side." He looked at the site plans she'd laid on the table. Clean lines, practical layout, oriented to catch the morning light on the ridge side. "How much?" he said. She looked at him. "I'm not offering," he said carefully. "I'm asking, differently than you think." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, 380, maybe 400, depending on materials. He nodded slowly. "There are 3 impact investment funds I know of that specialize in rural arts infrastructure. One of them is out of Nashville. They've done smaller projects in this county before." He paused. "I can make introductions. Not funding, introductions. You'd go in with your own numbers and your own proposal, and they'd evaluate you on the merits, which means they'd fund you." He looked at the site plans again. "This is fundable, Zara, on its own terms." She looked at the plans. At him, at the plans again. "Introductions," she said. "That's all." A long quiet. The fire in the sitting room popped. The snow continued its work on the roof. "Okay," she said. She started gathering the papers into a neat stack, the way she always did at the end of a work session. Organized, deliberate, treating the plans like the serious documents they were. She hesitated. Her hands went still on the papers. "There's something I want to show you," she said. She said it quietly, not quite looking at him. "Now?" "Tomorrow. In the morning." She stood, the papers under her arm. "It's in the house. I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I wasn't sure I was going to. But you've been honest with me about things that cost you something to be honest about, and I think—" She stopped again. Her jaw was doing the thing it did. "I'll show you in the morning." He didn't ask what it was. "Good night, Calloway," she said. "Good night, Zara." She went upstairs. He sat at the table for another hour, the fire going low in the next room, the snow settling into something quieter outside. And he thought about what she had said. You're allowed to grieve a thing even if you should have protected it better. And he thought about how long it had been since anyone had said something to him that was simultaneously true and kind. He had been alone for 5 years. He had told himself it was a choice. At 1 in the morning, in the guest room, with the snow still coming down outside the window and the house entirely quiet around him, Calloway Ashford did something he had not done in longer than he could reliably account for. He wept, not dramatically, not with any performance of it. Just the slow, private dissolution of a man who has been holding something together by force of will for a very long time and has finally, in the quiet of someone else's house, been allowed to put it down. He cried for the baby he never knew about, for the January night he hadn't been there for the years he'd spent building something that his partner had been hollowing out from the inside, for the 15 years of early mornings and late nights that had added up to a number in a portfolio that felt, tonight, like a very expensive way to be alone. He cried, and then he stopped, and then he lay in the dark and listened to the snow. And somewhere in the early hours, before sleep finally came, he thought about Zara's hands on the basket frame. Steady, unhurried, making something strong and beautiful out of whatever they were given. The thing she wanted to show him was a journal. She brought it down at breakfast, a soft-covered book with a worn spine and a clasp that no longer closed all the way, the cover stained with what looked like a ring from a coffee mug and something else along the bottom edge that had long since dried. She set it on the table between them without ceremony, the way you set down something heavy that you've been carrying a long time. "It was my mother's," she said. She poured her coffee and sat across from him. She kept it from about 1987 until she passed. The last entry is dated 3 weeks before she died. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She gave it to Denise to give to me. I found it in Denise's things when I was clearing her apartment. A pause. "I haven't let anyone else read it." He looked at the journal, did not reach for it. "Why are you showing it to me?" Zara looked at the window. The snow had stopped overnight, and the morning was white and still, the hills beyond the property blanketed and softened. Every edge rounded off. It looked like a different world than the one they'd been living in. "There's something in it I need you to see," she said. "Not all of it. A page, maybe a page and a half." She looked back at him. "I found it about 6 months after I moved here. I've read that section probably 40 times since then." She paused. "I was going to burn the book at one point. I didn't." Another pause. "I'm glad I didn't." She opened the journal to a page she had marked with a folded receipt. Deep in the book, near the end, the handwriting on the page smaller and more effortful than earlier entries, the hand of a woman writing carefully. She turned it to face him and slid it across the table. He looked at her. She nodded. He picked it up and read. The entry was dated November 14th, 2019. 3 weeks, he calculated quickly, before his and Zara's divorce was finalized. 2 months, approximately, before he'd found out that Zara had been pregnant and lost the baby, or rather, before he'd been told what he had been told. Her mother's handwriting was precise and unhurried. "Zara called tonight. She didn't say what was wrong, but I know my daughter's voice when she's holding something back. She said she was fine. She said Calloway was fine. She said everything was fine. And I counted 5 sentences before I stopped counting because I already knew. Some things a mother simply knows. I've been thinking about that husband of hers, Calloway. I've met him 3 times. The engagement dinner, the wedding, the Christmas before last. He has the eyes of a man who doesn't know yet what he's for, Not cruel eyes, just unfinished. The kind of man who builds things because he doesn't know what else to do with what he's carrying. I worry for her. Not because she isn't strong. She is the strongest of my children, the one who learned early that the world doesn't arrange itself around your feelings, and made her peace with that before I was ready to watch her make it. I worry because strength doesn't protect you from the particular grief of loving someone who isn't ready to be loved that way yet. But I'll tell you what I know, and I know it the way I know the weather and my own name. The right man always finds his way back to the right woman. Not the easy way, not without cost, the way water finds the river, slowly around obstacles, losing some of itself to the ground along the way, but getting there, always getting there. I hope he finds his way before she stops waiting. I hope she gives him the room to. Calloway set the journal down. He did not speak for a long moment. He was aware of Zara across the table, her hands still around her mug, watching him with the particular attention of someone who is trying to read a thing they have memorized and understand it from a new angle. "She wrote this before," he said finally, "before we divorced. 3 weeks before. She knew. She knew something." Zara's voice was careful and quiet. She didn't know the specifics. She didn't know about... She stopped, recalibrated. About the pregnancy. I hadn't told her yet. I was going to, and then things moved fast, and I never did. She looked at the journal. But she knew something was wrong. She always did. He looked at the page again. The kind of man who builds things because he doesn't know what else to do with what he's carrying. The precision of it. A woman he'd met 3 times had gotten closer to him in a journal entry than anyone who'd spent 15 years across a boardroom table. "Zara," he said. He stopped. The thing he needed to say was large, and he needed to find the right door into it. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without making it smaller than it is, because I've spent 5 years making it smaller, and I'm not going to do that anymore." She set her mug down, gave him her full attention. "When I left," he said, "Brennan told me something 3 days later. He said you had called him, that you'd asked him to relay a message because you didn't want to speak to me directly." He paused. The words were careful and cost him something. "He said you'd terminated the pregnancy, that you'd said you were relieved, that you'd said you were ready to move forward, and that you didn't want any contact." He held her gaze. "I believed him. I don't know why I believed him. I should have called you. I should have picked up the phone and called you and confirmed what you actually said, and I didn't because I was..." He stopped. "I was a coward, and I told myself it was respect for your wishes, but it was cowardice." The kitchen was very quiet. Zara had gone still in the particular way she went still when something was happening inside her that she wasn't going to let reach her face until she understood it fully. "He told you I terminated," she said slowly. "Yes." "And that I was relieved." "Yes." "And you believed that." "Not an accusation, not yet. Processing." "I believed it because it was easier than calling," he said, "because calling would have meant..." He stopped, pressed forward. "It would have meant having to be the person I was afraid I wasn't capable of being. And Brennan gave me a door that looked like information, but was actually just an exit." He paused. "I walked through it. That's on me. The lie was his, and the choice was mine, and both things are true at the same time." Zara stood up from the table. She turned to the window. She stood looking out at the white hills for a long time, her arms folded, her back to him, and he watched her breathe through something enormous. He did not move. He did not speak. He had learned at some point in these 3 weeks that some of the most important things you can do for another person are the things you don't do. She turned around. Her eyes were bright and dry. She was not going to cry in front of him, he understood, or perhaps she had simply processed this in some form already and was now standing at the other side of it, looking back. "He told you I was relieved," she said again. "Yes, I was—" She stopped. Her jaw was working. A jaw. "I was alone in your sister's guest room in Atlanta in January, and I was losing our baby on the bathroom floor, and I called a nurse hotline because I couldn't afford the emergency room, and the whole time I kept thinking—" She stopped, pulled herself back. "I thought about calling you. Every hour for 3 days, I thought about calling you." She paused. "I didn't because I thought you'd made yourself clear. I thought you were gone." A beat. "And you were gone because Brennan told you I was relieved." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since Tuesday night. Delphine's investigation of Brennan's communications history turned up the call records." He paused. "There's a transcript of the call he made to his assistant the morning after he told me. He documented it. Apparently he documented everything. His assistant asked if he was sure, and Brennan said—" Calloway stopped, steadied himself. He said, "It's cleaner this way. Cal needs to move forward, and so does she." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. "Cleaner," Zara said. "Yes." She turned back to the window. When she spoke again, her voice was very quiet and very controlled, the control clearly costing her. "He decided," she said. "A man who did not know me and did not love me and had no right to either of our lives, decided that the cleanest outcome was to make sure we never spoke again, and he built his entire acquisition scheme on the assumption that we wouldn't." A pause. "Because if we'd spoken, if we'd ever just spoken—" "None of this would have happened," Calloway said. "Or it would have happened differently. Or—" He stopped. "We can't know." "No," she said. "We can't." She turned from the window. She came back to the table and sat down, and she picked up her mother's journal and held it in both hands, looking at the worn cover. "I'm so angry," she said, quietly, simply, "the way you say a true thing." "I know. Not just at him." She looked up. "At you too. For the part that was yours, for not calling." "I know." "And at myself," she said, "for not calling either." He held her gaze. "What do we do with that?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the journal. She looked at the window. She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I know." She set the journal down. "But I'm not going to bury it either. I did that once and it cost me 5 years and it didn't make me lighter." She looked at him steadily. "So we're going to sit with it, and we're going to be honest about what it costs and what it's worth and what's possible." She paused. "And we're not going to rush it." He nodded. "We're not going to rush it." The weeks that followed moved in their own time. Delphine's fraud case built steadily. The forensic document analysis came back definitive in mid-December, and Brennan Weiss resigned from Ashford Capital's board on a Thursday afternoon before the filing reached the federal prosecutor's office in what everyone understood was a last-ditch attempt to manage his exposure. It didn't work particularly well. The investigation continued regardless, and the Millbrook Ridge Development Corridor quietly collapsed as the consortium partners began distancing themselves from Vellecroft land partners, with the speed of people leaving a building that has started to smell like smoke. Orsolia Vance filed the independent property rights challenge in circuit court and won on summary judgment in January, which was faster than anyone had predicted, and which Ms. Keturah celebrated by making a cake that was, by any objective measure, excessive. The Nashville Impact Investment Fund that Calloway had introduced Zara to made a site visit in December and returned in January with a term sheet for $360,000. Zara negotiated them to 380 on her own, without Calloway in the room. He found this out afterward and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already obvious. The second studio broke ground in March. Calloway did not move to Millbrook. He was clear about that with himself and clear about it with Zara. He had an apartment in Nashville now, a 2-bedroom on the east side that he was renting month to month while he figured out what the next thing looked like. And he had a new consulting practice that was smaller and slower and more deliberate than anything he'd run before, and he was discovering that smaller and slower suited him in ways that larger and faster never quite had. He drove out to Millbrook on weekends when Zara said he could. Not every weekend. Some weekends she needed space, and he was learning to hear the difference between the version of "I'll see you next week" that meant she was glad he was coming, and the version that meant she needed the week to herself. He was getting better at it. He was not yet good at it, but he was getting better, and she was patient with the process in a way that felt like the most generous thing anyone had ever offered him. He learned to weave on a Saturday morning in February. He did not ask to. Imani had been watching him watch Zara work for approximately 45 minutes with the focused patience of a child who has identified an adult who needs instruction, and she had gotten up from where she was sitting and dragged over a child's practice frame and a handful of flat reed and set it in front of him with the authority of someone who has made a decision. "You hold it like this," she said, "not tight. You just hold it." He held it. It was harder than it looked. The reed didn't behave. The tension was wrong, and then too right, and then wrong again, and the early attempts were uneven in ways that were technically functional but aesthetically catastrophic. Zara watched from across the studio and said nothing for a while. Then she got up and came over and crouched beside him and put her hands over his, not taking over, just adjusting, and said, "Here, feel where the resistance is. You're fighting it. Stop fighting it and it goes where you want it to." He stopped fighting it. It was still bad, but it was better. Imani watched them both with the expression of someone supervising a rehabilitation project who is cautiously optimistic about the patient's prognosis. On a Sunday afternoon in late April, 3 weeks before the second studio was due to open, Calloway sat in the front yard of Millbrook Hollow with a practice frame in his lap and a length of natural rye grass that he was making a genuine, if imperfect, effort to weave into something that resembled a base. He had been at it for an hour. The chickens were conducting their investigations of the yard around him with the business-like efficiency he'd come to find oddly comforting. Roswell Fitch was in the main barn, running a hand plane over a new workbench for the studio, the sound of it travelling across the yard in long, rhythmic strokes. Somewhere inside the farmhouse, Ms. Katura was having a principled disagreement with Imani about whether a straw hat was appropriate headwear for a child who was supposed to be taking a nap. It was not appropriate, Ms. Katura felt. Imani disagreed. The chickens had no opinion. Zara came out of the studio barn and crossed the yard with 2 mugs of coffee and set one beside him on the ground and sat in the grass nearby, close enough that the world felt the way it does when the distance between 2 people has been worked down to something real and honest and unperformed. She looked at the basket frame. "It's better," she said. "It's terrible. It's better than last week." She tilted her head. "The base is even. That's the hardest part." He looked at it. She was right. The base was even. He hadn't noticed. "Your mother," he said, "in the journal." He didn't look up from the weaving. "She said the right man always finds his way back." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "I know you have." She wrote it before she knew anything, before she knew how it ended or if there was an end. He finally looked up. "She was writing it for you, not for me." "I know. But—" He stopped, tried again. "But I think she was also right." He held her gaze. I think this is what finding your way back looks like. Not a moment, not a grand thing, just... He looked at the half-woven frame in his hands. Sitting in someone's yard and learning to stop fighting the resistance. Zara looked at him for a long time. The morning light was doing what it always did in this yard, coming through the oak tree at an angle that made the whole place look like something painted from memory, golden and specific and entirely itself. She did not say everything she was thinking. She was still Zara. She held things until she was sure of them, and then she offered them carefully, the way she offered everything of value, with both hands and without hurry. But she moved slightly closer, and she picked up her coffee, and she sat beside him in the warm April morning, while the chickens worked the yard, and Roswell's plane moved over the wood in long, steady strokes, and she watched him weave, imperfectly, honestly, with more patience than she'd expected from him, and she did not look away. The last entry in her mother's journal was not dated. It was 3 lines written in a different pen than the rest, darker ink, a slightly heavier hand, as though written in a single deliberate moment. My girls will be all right. They always find their way. The land remembers what the heart forgets, and the heart remembers what the mind is afraid to keep. Build something worth coming back to. Someone always will. The end.